Look who finally decided to show up. Bradley Hayes lifted his champagne glass as the rooftop reunion turned toward the entrance all at once. Soft jazz drifted through the warm summer air above downtown Chicago, but the laughter that followed his voice cut sharper than the wind 40 stories above the street. Naomi Carter stopped near the doorway, one hand still resting on the strap of her black handbag. The city lights shimmered behind her through walls of glass, turning her silhouette into something almost cinematic, but nobody in the room cared about that yet. They were too busy staring. Too busy remembering the woman Bradley divorced 3 years ago. Naomi, Bradley said again, smiling wider this time as he wrapped an arm around the waist of his fiancée, a blonde influencer half the room recognized from social media. We were starting to think you wouldn't come without a +1. A few people laughed into their drinks. Someone near the bar whispered loud enough to be heard. She looks tired. Naomi heard it. Of course she did. But she didn't react. She simply smoothed the sleeve of her dark green dress and stepped farther into the light. It wasn't designer. It wasn't flashy. But it fit her with quiet elegance, the kind that didn't beg for attention. Bradley's fiancée glanced at Naomi's shoes and smirked. Oh my God, she muttered to her friend, I used to own those heels in college. More laughter. Phones slowly lifted around the rooftop, tiny camera lenses pointing toward Naomi like they were waiting for her to break apart on command. Bradley loved this part. Naomi could tell by the way he leaned back against the marble bar, confident and relaxed, like the entire night had been built for this exact moment. Maybe it had. Still living downtown? He asked casually. Or did rent finally chase you out to the suburbs? Naomi looked at him quietly. The amber lights above the rooftop reflected softly against her skin while the skyline glowed behind her like a painting. 3 years ago, comments like that would have shattered her. 3 years ago, she would have lowered her eyes and searched for the nearest exit before anyone noticed she was hurting. But not. Tonight. Tonight, she only smiled faintly and set her clutch on the nearest table. The movement was calm. Controlled. Dangerous in a way nobody there understood yet. Because while Bradley was busy performing for the crowd, Naomi's phone vibrated softly beside her hand. One new message appeared across the screen. I'm downstairs. Naomi lowered the brightness on her phone before anyone nearby could read the message glowing across the screen. I'm downstairs. Used 5 simple words, but somehow they changed the temperature of the night. Around here, the rooftop buzzed with expensive laughter and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Chicago stretched endlessly beyond the glass railing, glowing gold beneath the summer sky, but Naomi suddenly felt detached from all of it, like she was standing outside the moment watching it happen to someone else. Bradley took another slow sip of his drink, enjoying the attention far too much to stop now. You know, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, Naomi always hated these kinds of events when we were married. Said rich people were fake. His fiancée laughed immediately, almost on cue. That explains why she looked so uncomfortable. More smiles. More whispers. Naomi reached for a sparkling water from a passing tray instead of wine. Her fingers stayed perfectly steady. That seemed to disappoint them most of all. Bradley tilted his head slightly, studying her face like he was searching for cracks. 3 years ago, he knew exactly how to hurt her. A certain joke. A certain tone. A carefully timed humiliation in front of other people. Back then, Naomi would have carried his words home like bruises nobody else could see. But tonight, she only looked tired of pretending he still mattered. I heard you are doing freelance work now, Bradley continued. Interior decorating, right? He smiled faintly. That must barely pay rent downtown these days. A man standing beside him chuckled into his bourbon. Naomi glanced toward the skyline instead of answering. The wind carried the distant sound of sirens far below the rooftop, blending with the music and conversation around her. Somewhere beneath the building, traffic lights reflected against wet pavement from an earlier rainstorm. The city looked alive. Bigger than this room. Bigger than Bradley Hayes. Actually, Naomi said softly, finally turning back toward him, peace is a lot cheaper than pretending to be happy. The table went quiet for half a second. Just enough for Bradley's smile to tighten at the corners. His fiancée quickly grabbed his arm again. "Baby, are we still announcing the engagement tonight?" she asked Bradley, trying to pull the attention back. Bradley relaxed instantly. "Of course." He raised his glass toward the crowd again. "Might as well give people something worth celebrating." Applause scattered across the rooftop. Phones lifted once more. Naomi looked down at her screen again as another message appeared. "Elevator just opened." Then, almost immediately after that, something shifted near the entrance behind her. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Even the bartender straightened his posture without realizing it. And Bradley's confident smile faded for the very first time that night. The music did not stop, but somehow the rooftop no longer sounded the same. Conversations faded unevenly across the room, one table at a time, until even the laughter near the bar became uncertain. Naomi did not turn around immediately. She noticed the change before she saw the reason for it. The waiter suddenly stood straighter. The event manager near the elevator adjusted his jacket twice in nervous succession. A man holding a whiskey glass lowered it halfway to the table without taking another sip. Bradley noticed it too. His expression tightened as he glanced toward the entrance behind Naomi. "Who is that?" his fiancée whispered softly, though nobody answered her. Naomi finally looked over her shoulder. The elevator door stood open beneath the soft gold lighting of the rooftop entrance. And there he was. Alexander King stepped out calmly, one hand resting in the pocket of his charcoal overcoat while the Chicago wind moved lightly through his dark hair. No loud entrance. No performance. No desperate need for attention. Yet the entire room reacted to him anyway. So many people immediately recognized his face from business magazines and financial interviews. Others recognized him from something simpler. Power. Real power never needed to introduce itself twice. Behind him, two hotel executives hurried forward almost instantly. One of them extended a hand with visible nervousness. "Mr. King," he said carefully, "we did not realize you would be attending tonight." Bradley's face lost color so quickly it almost looked unreal beneath the rooftop lights. Naomi saw it happen from across the room. The confidence. The elegance. The easy smile he had worn all evening. All of it cracked at once. Because Bradley knew exactly who Alexander King was. Everyone in finance did. Alexander was the billionaire investor currently negotiating the acquisition of Bradley's company. For the past 6 months, Bradley had practically built his entire future around getting into Alexander King's inner circle. And now the most important man in his professional life was walking directly toward the woman he spent the entire night humiliating. Naomi stayed still beside the glass railing while Alexander crossed the rooftop floor. Calm. Unurried. His polished shoes echoed softly against the marble tiles beneath the music. People instinctively stepped aside to let him pass. Bradley's fiancée released his arm completely without even realizing she had done it. "No way," someone whispered near the bar. "That is Alexander King." Naomi looked up as he finally stopped in front of her. The city lights reflected softly in his eyes while the wind carried the faint scent of rain from the streets below. And for the first time all night, Naomi's expression softened completely. Not because she needed saving. Not because she needed revenge. But because standing in front of him reminded her how far she had come from the woman Bradley used to control. Alexander smiled gently as he reached for her hand. Then, in front of the entire rooftop, he lifted it to his lips and said quietly, "I am sorry I am late, wife." Silence swallowed the room whole. For a moment, nobody moved. The rooftop stood frozen beneath the glow of hanging lights and the distant pulse of Chicago traffic below. Bradley stared at Naomi and Alexander like his mind could not arrange the image into something believable. His fiancée looked between them with parted lips, still clutching the champagne glass she had stopped drinking from several seconds earlier. Naomi slowly lowered her hand after Alexander kissed it, her calm expression unchanged while whispers spread through the rooftop like a wave rolling across dark water. "Wife," someone repeated quietly near the bar. Another voice answered almost immediately. "Since when is Naomi Carter married to Alexander King?" Bradley finally forced a laugh, but it sounded thin and strained now. "Okay," he said, trying to recover, "that is actually pretty funny." Nobody laughed with him this time. Alexander turned his attention toward Bradley politely, though there was something dangerously composed in the stillness of his expression. "Bradley Hayes," he said evenly. "We have not officially met yet." Bradley swallowed quickly before stepping forward to shake his hand. "Actually, sir, I work for Stratton Financial. We have been hoping to schedule a meeting regarding the merger." Alexander nodded once, calm and unreadable. "I know exactly who you are." The words landed softly, but Bradley's face tightened anyway. Naomi noticed the small details nobody else would have caught. The way Bradley adjusted his watch twice. The faint redness creeping into his neck. The nervous shift in his posture from confidence to caution. 3 years ago, she would have felt satisfaction watching him unravel. Tonight, she only felt distant from it all, like the old version of herself had finally disappeared somewhere behind the skyline. One of the reunion organizers hurried over with an overly polished smile. "Mr. King, we would be honored to move you and your wife to the private terrace section." "Wife." The word echoed again. Naomi could practically feel the room trying to recalculate her value in real time. The same people who laughed at her 30 minutes earlier were suddenly studying her dress differently. Her posture differently. Her silence differently. It was never about who she truly was. It was about who stood beside her. And somehow that realization hurt more than Bradley's insults ever did. Alexander looked down at Naomi gently. "Would you like to stay?" he asked quietly. It was such a simple question, but Naomi noticed the difference immediately. Bradley always decided for her. Alexander asked. The rooftop lights reflected softly against the glass railing as Naomi glanced across the room one more time. She saw old classmates pretending not to stare. She saw Bradley's fiancée forcing a smile that no longer looked natural. She saw Bradley himself struggling to hold onto the version of the night he thought he controlled. Then Naomi picked up her clutch from the table and slipped her hand into Alexander's arm. "No," she said softly. "I think I have seen enough." But just as they turned toward the private terrace entrance, Bradley's voice stopped them one last time. "Naomi." She paused without looking back. The rooftop went silent again. And when Bradley finally spoke, his voice no longer carried arrogance. Only disbelief. "Why did you never tell anyone about him?" Naomi closed her eyes for half a second before answering quietly, "Because the best things that ever happened to me began after I stopped needing people to believe me." The private terrace overlooked the entire city, quieter than the main rooftop and washed in soft amber light from the hanging lanterns above. Below them, traffic flowed through downtown Chicago like ribbons of red and white beneath the midnight sky. Naomi rested both hands lightly against the glass railing while the wind moved gently through her hair. Being here, the sounds of the reunion had become distant again, muted by thick glass doors and expensive architecture. For the first time all night, she could finally breathe. Alexander loosened the cuff of his jacket slightly before stepping beside her. He did not ask if she was all right. He never insulted her strength by asking questions he already understood the answer to. Instead, he simply stood there with her in silence, letting the city speak first. "You handled that better than I would have," he said quietly after a moment. Naomi let out a soft laugh under her breath. 3 years ago, I probably would have cried in the bathroom. Alexander looked at her then, not with pity, but with the calm attention that always made her feel seen instead of judged. 3 years ago, he replied, you were surviving. The words settled into her chest heavier than she expected. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the streets below. Somewhere down there, taxis cut through intersections while strangers hurried home carrying grocery bags and takeout containers, completely unaware that her entire past had just collided with her present 40 stories above them. You know what hurts the most? She asked softly. It was not Bradley humiliating me tonight. Alexander stayed quiet, listening. It was how quickly everyone changed the second they realized who you were. She shook her head faintly. 5 minutes earlier, they looked at me like I was a failure. The skyline reflected in the glass beside them, stretching endlessly into darkness and light. And now? Alexander asked gently. Naomi smiled without humor. Now they look at me like I suddenly matter. Alexander rested one arm against the railing beside her. People respect power because they are afraid of being without it. Naomi glanced toward him. And what about you? He looked back at the rooftop doors for a second before answering. I respected you long before any of them knew your name. Her expression softened again. That was the difference. Bradley loved attention. Alexander noticed details. Bradley measured worth through status. Alexander measured it through character. Naomi still remembered the first night they met almost 2 years earlier. She had been sitting alone inside a small 24-hour cafe during a thunderstorm, exhausted after finishing a 12-hour shift and freelance design work on the same day. Her laptop barely held a charge. Her coffee had gone cold an hour earlier. Most people would have looked at her and seen a tired woman struggling to rebuild her life after divorce. But Alexander had walked in wearing a dark coat damp from the rain, noticed the sketches spread across her table, and asked one simple question. Did you design those yourself? Not what car she drove. Not who she knew. Not what she looked like standing beside him. Used her work. Naomi closed her eyes briefly at the memory. I almost did not come tonight, she admitted softly. Alexander smiled faintly beside her. I know. She turned toward him fully now. Then why did you let me? The wind swept across the terrace again as Alexander studied her carefully before answering. Because healing sounds different when it finally stops shaking. Naomi looked out over the city again after Alexander's words settled between them. Healing sounds different when it finally stops shaking. She repeated the sentence silently in her head while the wind brushed against her skin and carried the distant scent of rain across the terrace. Somewhere behind the glass doors, the reunion continued without them, but the energy had changed now. She could feel it even from outside. Curiosity had replaced mockery. Respect had replaced pity. And somehow that transformation exhausted her more than the insults ever did. Alexander noticed the shift in her expression immediately. You are thinking too hard again, he said softly. Naomi smiled faintly. I spent years trying to prove I was not a failure after the divorce. She folded her arms loosely against the cool night air. Tonight made me realize something ugly. Alexander waited patiently. Most people only respect survival when it arrives wearing expensive shoes. The city lights reflected in his eyes as he studied her quietly. And yet you survived before any of them ever applauded you. Naomi let out a slow breath. That part was true. Nobody saw the tiny apartment she moved into after the divorce papers were signed. Nobody saw the nights she sat on the kitchen floor surrounded by unpaid bills while the radiator clicked loudly through winter mornings. Bradley had left with confidence, connections, and the certainty that Naomi would eventually crawl back asking for help. Instead, she rebuilt herself in silence. One freelance client at a time. One exhausting shift at a time. One lonely morning at a time. She still remembered standing inside crowded subway cars at 6 in the morning while holding fabric samples and design sketches against her chest because she could not afford to lose them in the rain. Back then, nobody looked at her the way they did tonight. Nobody moved aside when she entered a room. Nobody whispered her name with admiration. But she kept going anyway. Alexander reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something folded neatly in half. I almost forgot, he said. Naomi looked down as he handed her a cream-colored envelope with elegant gold lettering pressed into the paper. She opened it carefully beneath the terrace lights. Inside was an invitation to the annual King Foundation Charity Gala in Manhattan the following month. Her eyes moved slowly across the embossed names at the bottom of the card. Hosted by Alexander King and Naomi Carter King. Naomi looked up immediately. You added my name as host? Alexander smiled gently. You are the reason the foundation doubled its scholarship program this year. She stared at him quietly, almost overwhelmed by how naturally he said things like that. No performance. No need to impress anyone nearby. Used truth spoken calmly. Bradley would lose his mind if he saw this invitation, she said before she could stop herself. Alexander's expression softened slightly. Naomi. She looked at him. Your life is too beautiful now to keep measuring it against people who tried to diminish it. The words hit harder than she expected. Before she could answer, the terrace doors suddenly opened behind them. Naomi turned slightly as one of the hotel managers stepped outside, visibly nervous. Mr. King, he said carefully, I apologize for interrupting, but Mr. Hayes is requesting a private conversation with you. The wind swept across the terrace again as Alexander glanced toward Naomi first before responding. And for the first time that night, Bradley Hayes was the one waiting nervously to be acknowledged. Alexander did not answer the hotel manager immediately. He glanced at Naomi first, calm and unreadable beneath the terrace lights, as if her comfort mattered more than whatever conversation Bradley Hayes suddenly believed he deserved. Naomi understood that look now. It was never about control with Alexander. It was always choice. Do you want me to handle this? He asked quietly. Naomi leaned lightly against the glass railing and looked through the terrace doors toward the rooftop beyond them. Bradley stood near the center of the room pretending to stay composed, but even from a distance she could see the strain in his posture. His fiancée had drifted several feet away, distracted by whispers and curious stares from people who suddenly seemed far more interested in Alexander King than her social media following. Naomi remembered another night years ago when Bradley stood in their old apartment packing expensive watches into a suitcase while explaining why their marriage no longer fit the future he wanted. Back then, he spoke with the certainty of a man convinced he would always move upward while she stayed behind. You are too emotional for this world, Naomi, he had told her coldly. You survive things instead of winning them. The memory no longer hurt the way it used to. That surprised her most of all. No, Naomi said softly, turning back toward Alexander. I think I should hear what he has to say. Alexander studied her for a moment before nodding once. Together, they stepped back through the glass doors onto the rooftop. Conversations immediately quieted again as heads turned toward them. The skyline shimmered behind the crowd while soft jazz continued playing from hidden speakers overhead, though now the music sounded strangely distant beneath all the tension filling the room. Bradley straightened when they approached. He tried to smile, but the confidence from earlier had vanished completely. Naomi, he began carefully, can we talk for a second? Naomi folded one arm lightly across her waist while Alexander remained beside her, calm and silent. Bradley noticed that silence. It unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. You spent the entire night talking, Naomi replied evenly. Now suddenly you want privacy. A few people nearby lowered their eyes awkwardly into their drinks. Bradley exhaled slowly. Look, maybe I crossed a line earlier. Naomi almost smiled at the understatement. Bradley glanced briefly toward Alexander before continuing. I did not know, his voice faded. He could not even finish the sentence. He did not know you mattered now. That was what he really meant. Naomi saw it clearly. Alexander remained perfectly still beside her, offering Bradley nothing to hold on to emotionally. No intimidation. No anger. Used presence. Bradley swallowed hard. Stratton Financial has been trying to secure this acquisition for months, he admitted carefully. My position on the board depends on it. Naomi noticed the shift instantly. This was no longer about old memories or regret. This was fear. Bradley Hayes was afraid. For years, he had walked through life believing Naomi would always remain beneath him somehow. Easier to dismiss. Easier to underestimate. But tonight, every social advantage he once weaponized against her had collapsed in front of an audience. Alexander finally spoke, his tone calm enough to make Bradley even more nervous. Your company's future will be decided by numbers and leadership, Mr. It paused briefly. Not by who you choose to humiliate at reunions. The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Bradley looked down for half a second before meeting Naomi's eyes again. And for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain around her. The rooftop remained painfully quiet after Alexander's words settled into the air. Nobody rushed to save Bradley now. Nobody laughed for him anymore. The same crowd that spent the evening enjoying Naomi's humiliation suddenly looked uncomfortable standing too close to it. Bradley forced another breath through tightened lungs and glanced around the room as if searching for solid ground that no longer existed beneath him. Naomi noticed how small he looked without admiration protecting him. It was strange. For years, she remembered him as larger than life. Louder. Sharper. Untouchable. But standing there now beneath the soft rooftop lights, Bradley Hayes looked exactly like what he truly was. Used to men terrified of losing status. Naomi, he said quietly, almost carefully this time, I never meant for tonight to go this far. Naomi held his gaze without anger. That was what unsettled him most. Not revenge. Not rage. Used the absence of emotional control over her. You invited me here to make yourself feel bigger, she replied softly. And honestly? She glanced briefly around the rooftop at the lowered eyes and nervous silence surrounding them. It worked. For a while. Bradley looked down immediately. Across the room, his fiancée shifted awkwardly beside the bar, suddenly fascinated by her untouched champagne glass. Naomi almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Alexander stepped slightly closer beside Naomi, not possessive, not performative, simply present. The hotel lights reflected against the dark fabric of his coat while executives and guests nearby watched him with careful attention. Naomi realized something then. Alexander never once tried to prove his importance tonight. Everyone else did that for him automatically. Bradley cleared his throat. I know this is probably not my place anymore, he began slowly, but, are you actually happy? The question surprised the room. Naomi could feel it in the sudden stillness around them. Maybe because it was the first honest thing Bradley had asked all night. Naomi thought about the answer carefully. She thought about tiny apartments and exhausted mornings. She thought about cold coffee beside unfinished design sketches. She thought about rebuilding a life nobody applauded while she was living through it. Then she thought about peace. Real peace. The kind that no longer needed validation to feel real. Naomi smiled softly. I sleep without anxiety now, she answered. That is how I know. Bradley's expression shifted almost painfully at those words. Because deep down, he understood exactly what she meant. Success had given him attention. Money had given him influence. But peace? Peace was the one thing he never seemed able to keep. A cold breeze swept across the rooftop again as Alexander checked the time on his watch. Our driver is waiting downstairs, he said gently to Naomi. She nodded once. Together, they turned toward the elevator entrance while the crowd instinctively parted to make room for them. No one laughed now. No one whispered cruel comments. The only sound was soft music drifting through the warm Chicago night and the distant hum of traffic far below the building. Just before the elevator doors closed, Naomi looked back one final time. Bradley still stood near the center of the rooftop surrounded by people, yet somehow looking completely alone. And for the first time since their divorce, Naomi realized she no longer wanted him to regret losing her. She simply wanted to keep becoming the woman he never believed she could be. The elevator doors closed softly behind Naomi and Alexander, sealing the rooftop noise away almost instantly. Silence settled around them as the glass elevator began descending through the glowing Chicago skyline. Naomi watched the city lights slide slowly upward beyond the transparent walls while her reflection stared back at her faintly in the glass. For a few quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding all night. Alexander noticed immediately. He reached over and gently took her hand into his. "You did not need to prove anything to them," he said softly. Naomi looked down at their hands together before smiling faintly. "I know." And this time, she truly meant it. Years ago, she would have walked into a night like this desperate to be validated. Desperate to show Bradley what he lost. Desperate to hear people apologize for underestimating her. But standing inside that elevator now, descending through the heart of the city beside a man who respected her without conditions, Naomi realized something unexpected. The reunion had never really been about revenge. It was about closure. Not the loud kind. Not dramatic speeches or public humiliation returned with humiliation. Something quieter than that. Something stronger. Acceptance. The elevator doors opened into the private lobby downstairs where their driver waited beside a black sedan beneath warm golden lights. Outside, the pavement still shimmered from the earlier rainstorm, reflecting streaks of white headlights across the streets. A doorman hurried to open the car door, instantly recognizing Alexander, but Naomi barely noticed anymore. The attention no longer felt intoxicating. Used temporary. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Naomi glanced back up toward the rooftop high above them. Somewhere up there, Bradley Hayes was probably still standing beneath expensive lights. Trying to recover the version of himself that cracked apart the moment he realized she no longer needed his approval to feel valuable. And strangely enough, Naomi no longer hated him for any of it. Had required emotional weight she had already put down. Alexander opened the car door for her, but before getting inside, Naomi paused for a moment beneath the city lights. The wind moved softly against her dress while distant sirens echoed somewhere far across downtown Chicago. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked gently. Naomi smiled toward the skyline one last